tentang persamaan atau perbedaannya antara mereka berdua. Nah, acara ini nanti akan dibawain oleh Mr Milo. Nah, sebelum kita mulai, Pak Ian akan sedikit menjelaskan tentang apa sih itu Kaplan, kenapa sih Kaplan, dan kenapa harus pilih Kaplan, seperti itu. Baik, waktu dan tempatnya disilakan Pak Ian, bisa dimulai. Pak Ian. Pak Ian. Pak Ian. Pak. Oke.
Ya, ini sorry, udah
sudah
terdengar ya?
Sudah terdengar, Pak.
Oke.
Baik.
Selamat sore semua peserta untuk virtual mengenai GMAT dan GRE Math ya. Perkenalkan, saya Ian dari Kaplan Edupac yang lokasinya ada di gedung AIA Sentral, lantai 21, Jalan Jenderal Sudirman 48A. Jadi di tempat Kaplan ini adalah tempat untuk mempersiapkan mengenai tes prep ya, terutama untuk TOEFL, IELTS, SAT, GMAT maupun GRE. Nah, pada kesempatan ini saya akan sedikit memberikan informasi mengenai Kaplan Edupac. Jadi saya yakin sih sudah banyak ya yang mengetahui mengenai apa itu Kaplan Edupac, ya kan? Nah, kemudian nanti juga jangan lupa bahwa dari apa yang saya sampaikan, nanti pada di sesi akhir akan ada 2 pertanyaan yang kalian bisa jawab, perebutkan. Jadi ada voucher ya senilai 1 juta, nah di mana bisa kalian pakai untuk persiapan tes preparation. Nah, dalam rangka mempersiapkan persyaratan studi, kita harus benar-benar pintar dalam mempersiapkannya, karena ini adalah saat-saat yang penting untuk menentukan apa bisa diterima di sekolah yang dituju. Oke, nah Kaplan ini terkenal dengan the world leader in test preparation. Nah, Kaplan ini dikenal sebagai salah satu penyedia tes persiapan ujian terbesar di dunia. Nah, yang dimana yang pertama, Kaplan ini sudah cukup lama, lebih dari 80 tahun, yang telah memberikan jasa persiapan tes preparation. Jadi sebagai salah satu sekolah terbesar di dunia ya, yang concern di persiapan ujian. Nah, yang kedua adalah Kaplan ini sudah tersebar lebih dari 240 cabang di dunia. Jadi tidak hanya di Indonesia, ada Singapura, Aussie, UK, dan lain-lainnya. Nah, di mana terdapat 162 center di Amerika Serikat atau di US. Nah, kemudian yang ketiga, Kaplan dikenal sebagai satu-satunya penyedia tes preparation ujian terbesar. Ya, dengan pengalaman yang selama ini, Kaplan telah membantu lebih dari 3 juta siswa ya untuk mempersiapkan diri menghadapi ujian dalam mencapai tujuan, baik itu ke perguruan tinggi maupun ke karir dari masing-masing student. Oke, nah selanjutnya adalah kenapa sih kita perlu belajar di Kaplan? Nah, perlu diingat ya bahwa satu-satunya sekolah persiapan ujian yang mempunyai website sendiri. Nah, di sini di www.kaptes.com, nah di mana di sini mirip dengan tes resmi secara online dari US. Jadi latihan-latihan soalnya, kemudian untuk persiapan untuk ujiannya nanti, dan itu sudah mirip. Jadi seperti kita ketahui, nah, tes sekarang sudah banyak sekali yang online ya. Jadi karena student perlu latihan juga, di samping mengikuti preparation, dia harus latihan skill, strateginya maupun time manajemennya. Jadi pilih lembaga yang sudah punya latihan mirip dengan aslinya. Oke. Yang kedua adalah original material. Jadi kita sudah provide material sendiri, tentunya sudah melalui research and development. Nah, di mana ahli bahasa itu dapat memberikan material yang update menyesuaikan dengan perkembangan. Dan kenapa di Kaplan, untuk yang ketiga adalah gurunya berkualifikasi tinggi, jadi memiliki highly qualified teacher. Jadi Kaplan memiliki teacher-teacher yang berpengalaman dalam mengajar, jadi sehingga dipastikan setiap siswa mendapatkan teacher yang dapat membimbing untuk meningkatkan nilai atau skor dari siswa itu sendiri. Oke, nah next untuk selanjutnya adalah apa aja sih yang ada di Kaplan atau program-program apa aja sih yang ada di Kaplan. Nah, seperti yang tadi sudah saya sampaikan bahwa Kaplan ini sudah provide mengenai preparation GMAT, kemudian ada GRE atau TOEFL, IPT, IELTS, TOEFL, IPT, SAT. Nah, selain tes prep, kita juga punya persiapan. Jadi bagi kalian yang ingin improve mengenai bahasa Inggris, kita punya program General English, kemudian ada Academic Writing, ada Business English, academic, English for Academic Purpose, maupun Conversation Skill. Oke, next. Ya. Nah, ini adalah placement test result. Jadi pada saat nanti teman-teman di sini mempersiapkan mengenai preparation di Kaplan, nah itu nanti ada yang namanya kalau di GMAT itu ada CAT atau Computer Adaptive Test. Jadi sudah melakukan seperti international testnya dari website kita. Jadi nanti pada saat mengerjakan, nah kita bisa lihat nih berapa skor kita sih di awal, di pertengahan maupun di akhir untuk preparation. Nah, di mana skor GMAT kan top skor 800 ya. Kemudian untuk GRE sendiri itu ada kuantitatif dengan verbal juga, dan di mana scoringnya adalah top skornya 170 untuk kuantitatif, kemudian verbalnya 170 juga. Nah, ini juga ada jadi progresnya namanya MST, multi state test, dan berlaku dari nilai ataupun skor dari GRE atau 5 tahun. Oke, next selanjutnya adalah ini adalah placement test result mengenai TOEFL, IBT, kemudian ada IELTS maupun SAT. Jadi persiapan di Kaplan itu kalian akan mendapatkan progress test ya, di mana untuk mengetahui soal istilahnya soal-soal ataupun latihan-latihan soal untuk progres pertama berapa, kemudian mengikuti persiapan, kemudian di pertengahan ada progres, kemudian di akhir ada progres. Nah, itu ada di website Kaplan juga. Oke, next. Ya, ini adalah beberapa dari student kita, di mana testimoni bahwa student kita sudah mempersiapkan di Kaplan, jadi baik atau student IELTS ataupun student GMAT maupun student GRE. Seperti tadi di video juga sudah ada mereka yang telah mengikuti GRE preparation, kemudian TOEFL, IELTS. Nah, ini adalah mengenai testimoni dari IELTS. Nah, ini adalah student experience, dari pengalaman dari corporate kita. Jadi ada beberapa student yang telah kita bantu untuk persiapan mengenai preparation sampai mereka keberangkatan. Oke, next. Ya, ini contoh dari beberapa perusahaan yang telah kita bantu, diantaranya dari Pegadaian. Mereka sudah berangkat ke US 2021 kemarin. Oke, next. Ya, di beberapa klien kita, jadi ada Pegadaian, Amida, BRI, Jasa Marga, Polija, dan lain-lainnya. Oke, next Kak Gali. Ya, untuk slide kali ini adalah di mana selain kita mempunyai untuk test preparation, kita juga ada punya satu divisi Edu Expert, di mana di Edu Expert ini kita bantu student untuk free konsultasi mengenai persiapan studi luar negeri. Jadi mulai dari konsultasinya, kemudian mengenai online registration, kemudian student visa, sampai pada saat nanti misalnya diterima pengurusan flight ticket, accommodation. Jadi mereka yang sudah diterima, kita juga akan berikan briefing pre-departure-nya sampai urusan dokumen-dokumen admission-nya, seperti itu. Jadi nanti bisa dibantu oleh Kak Richard di Edu Expert. Oke, nah ini adalah seperti yang tadi saya sampaikan bahwa kita di bulan Mei ini ada promo, yaitu Amazing Test Prep Promo, di mana kalian bisa mengambil test preparation mendapatkan diskon 1 juta rupiah, baik TOEFL, IELTS, SAT, GMAT maupun GRE. Jadi jangan lupa kesempatan ini berlaku, memang terbatas. Jadi untuk teman-teman di sini yang membutuhkan bisa kontak di Kaplan Edupac. Oke. Selanjutnya, nah ini adalah voucher diskon ya, untuk 2 pertanyaan bagi mereka yang tadi sudah mendengar kira-kira apa aja sih yang tadi saya sampaikan. Jadi kalian bisa langsung bisa memenangkan voucher dengan pertanyaan yang saya akan berikan. Oke, pertanyaan pertama istilahnya udah siap ya Kak? Oh, oke, ini adalah nomor yang dapat kalian hubungin untuk menanyakan mengenai konsultasi free preparation dan free mengenai pengurusan studi luar negeri. Kak Jali? Halo? Ya. Kita berikan pertanyaannya Kak Jali. Unmute mic-nya Kak. Ya. Ya. Untuk pertanyaan pertama, oke, kalian bisa menyiapkan ya. Jadi nanti bisa unmute, kemudian nanti silakan menjawab nanti atau di chat. Nah nanti kalian bisa kita panggil siapa yang pertama. Oke, pertanyaan pertama, ada yang tahu berapa top score GMAT dan GRE? Ya, silakan.
Ya, silakan angkat tangan.
Angkat tangan boleh.
Untuk siapapun yang tahu.
Ya, ingat nggak tadi apa yang saya sampaikan bahwa berapa sih top score GMAT dan GRE? Udah sekali. Tuh, Sobat Jagar Patrian Diko.
Ya, 800 Pak.
Ya, Cagar, silakan di unmute. Cagar dan kameranya on kan. Ya, Kak Jali tadi Cagar ya, atas nama Cagar ya.
Iya. Emilio sama Dani Krisna. Di sini ada yang chat nih Pak, Emilio RGG 800 jawabannya, dan Dani Krisna jawabannya
ya,
GMAT 800.
Di unmute Kak, di unmute sama on kamera untuk menjawab pertanyaannya.
Oke, Kak Erni bisa minta di on kan?
Oke,
untuk
Cagar tadi saya lihat Cagar yang pertama.
Iya, silakan angkat tangan dulu, nanti hostnya yang menentukan siapa yang.
Kameranya di on kan Kak Cagar?
Oh gitu.
Ya, mana Kak Cagar?
Halo.
Oke, next ya, karena tadi tidak bisa kebuka kamera juga, kita kembalikan ke Kak Istiana. Silakan dijawab Kak. Unmute.
Iya, izin menjawab. Untuk top skor GRE 340, untuk GMAT 800.
Ya, 800 untuk GMAT, kemudian GRE 170 untuk masing-masing ya. Oke, jadi kuantitatif maupun verbal. Oke, selamat ya Kak Istiana untuk pertanyaan pertama. Jadi Kakak nanti tinggal tolong di chat nomor mobilenya untuk kami hubungin ya Kak. Selamat ya mendapatkan voucher untuk 1 juta. Oke, thank you. Oke, Kak Erni minta tolong untuk dicatat nomor handphonenya. Kemudian pertanyaan kedua ya, pertanyaan kedua silakan sebutkan mengenai keunggulan atau kelebihan Kaplan. Ya, siapa? Silakan. Ada yang bisa? Oke, Sevanya. Oke, Kak Sevanya, kameranya on, kemudian unmute. Minta tolong ke RHP. Kak Sevanya, silakan Kak.
Oke, baik Pak. Jadi yang dari saya perhatikan untuk kelebihan Kaplan Edupac itu, yang pertama latihannya itu, latihan soalnya sangat mirip persis dengan soal yang sebenarnya, dan yang kedua guru-gurunya juga berkualitas. Terima kasih.
Ada lagi yang ingat? Oke, baik. Oke, selamat ya Kak Sevanya telah menjawab pertanyaan kedua dan mendapatkan voucher 1 juta. Nanti biar mobilenya nanti dikirimkan ke kami, bisa lewat chat nanti untuk kami hubungi. Oke. Oke, Kak Jali silakan untuk persiapan preparation mengenai Kaplan sudah selesai. Silakan nanti mendengarkan Milo mengenai untuk GMAT maupun GRE Math-nya ya.
Ya, betul. Baik, terima kasih Pak Ian atas waktunya. Dan sekarang kita udah masuk ke main topik. Milo, are you there?
Kalau misalnya mau langsung di sana,
Hai Milo.
di Kaplan Medicalnya hanya di sini sekarang.
Okay, Ernie, could you please unmute for Milo?
Hello.
Okay, thank you, Milo. So, Milo, you can share your screen right now.
No, I can't.
Okay.
I can't share my screen.
You cannot, yeah. Okay.
Okay, now I can.
Okay, here we go. So, it's your turn now, Milo. Thank you. Dan selamat teman-teman semuanya, selamat menikmati acara dari tema kita hari ini, similarities and differences between GMAT and GRE Math. Okay, Milo, it's your turn.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, can you mute?
Okay.
Okay. Hello, my name is Milo. I've been teaching GMAT, GRE, SAT for about 16 years now. I've taken the actual, I've scored in the 99th percentile on GMAT, GRE, and SAT. I took the GMAT 3 times because it did take me a couple times to be able to score in the 99th percentile. It's kind of hard. Today we'll be focusing on the similarities and differences between the GMAT and the GRE. If you have any questions, post them in the chat and I'll get to them at the end of the presentation, okay? Okay. Now, something you need to understand about the GMAT and the GRE is that while they are similar tests, the intent is a bit different. The GMAT is primarily designed for MBA programs, so it focuses more on fluid intelligence or your ability to reason rather than the knowledge that you know. While the GRE is a broader test, it applies for the vast majority of graduate and postgraduate programs. So rather than testing targeted reasoning, it tends to test a broader base of knowledge. They are very similar, but because of the difference in intent, they have a difference in focus and structure. The GMAT puts more emphasis on fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence is more of your ability to use information rather than the information that you know. And then GRE puts more emphasis on crystallized intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is basically the things that you know. For example, crystallized intelligence would be something like knowing that 0 is an even integer, right? But knowing how to use an integer to solve for a question would be more fluid intelligence. Now, they, of course, both tests will test knowledge and reasoning, but the emphasis is a bit different. And because they have a difference in intent and emphasis, the questions and structures of the tests are also different. Okay, so the GMAT has one section, 31 questions, 62 minutes. You have exactly 2 minutes per question on the math. You have a little bit less than 2 minutes per question on verbal, but also about 2 minutes per question on verbal. The GRE has 2 scored sections, 20 questions per section, 35 minutes per section, or 1:45 per question. Basically, because the questions on the GMAT are harder, on average, than they are on the GMAT, they give you more time per question. Okay. GMAT has 2 general categories of question types. You have problem solving and data sufficiency. And as you can see, there are about 16 to 17 problem solving questions and 14 to 15 data sufficiency questions. And then GRE doesn't have data sufficiency, instead it has quantitative comparison. So both tests have their own unique version of questions, but again, reflecting the difference in focus, the GRE questions are quicker and easier Quantitative comparison questions are logically simpler than the data sufficiency questions. Okay. Data sufficiency. The data sufficiency question is basically a question where they give you information and ask you a question. And they ask you what information you need to answer that question. That's the basic intent of it. So on a data sufficiency question, they're not testing your ability to do math. They're testing your ability to understand the concepts. So if you on a lot of the data sufficiency questions, if you try to calculate it, it can take you 30 or 40 minutes. But you don't need to calculate it. You just need to know, could you calculate it? So if you understand the concepts, then you can answer the question without doing the calculation. And that is the primary difference between the GMAT and the GRE. Again, the GMAT is focusing on the concepts and logic, the ability to apply the information that you know. Okay. On data sufficiency, there are two general categories of data sufficiency questions. You have yes/no questions, and you have value questions. In both situations, the key though is to understand that you want one and only one answer. It doesn't matter what the answer is, but you would need a definitive answer. As I already mentioned, it's most likely to test concepts rather than calculations. And in the courses, I have a general saying that I say a lot: if you're doing the calculations, you're probably doing it wrong. Data sufficiency isn't about calculation, but about knowing whether or not you could calculate. Okay. Data sufficiency, it tends to be the hardest questions for most people on the GMAT, even harder than like the sentence correction and stuff like that on the verbal section. Even in Indonesians, most people will tend to have more difficulty with data sufficiency than they will in most of the verbal concepts, in particular with number properties. But it's not that the questions are actually hard, it just tends to be that the logic is new, so it's something that you're not used to thinking about. So it's a type of logic that you're not familiar with. So with familiarity, these actually become very easy because you don't need to do the calculations. You just need to understand what they are looking for and how to approach the question. So a data sufficiency question will have 4 parts to it. You have facts in the question stem. So the question stem will tell you, for example, J is an integer, K is an integer, and that tell you that J times K is equal to 12. So those will all be facts given to you. And then the question stem would be something like, what is the value of K? So what is K equal to? And then you are given 2 additional facts. You're giving statement 1 and statement 2. Statement 1 and statement 2 are additional facts. They are always true. So for example, here, statement 1 would be J divided by K is an integer. That's another way of saying that J is divisible by K, or that J is divisible by 6, or that J is a multiple of 6. It's another way of thinking about it. And facts in statement 2 tells you that K divided by 2 is an integer. Now, there's an infinite number of possible numbers that are divisible by 6 and divisible by 2. So by themselves, these wouldn't be sufficient to answer the question. Okay? So that's what the question would look like. It will look something like that. If J and K are integers and JK is equal to 12, what is the value of K? Statement 1, J over K is an integer. Statement 2, K divided by 2 is an integer. Now your job here is not to solve for the value of K, but to determine if you know the value of K. Can you solve for it? Okay. And the answers will go like this. There are 5 possible answers: A, B, C, D, and E. A is 1 is sufficient. B is 2 is sufficient. C is you need statement 1 and statement 2 together. D is either one. Number 1 is sufficient and number 2 is sufficient by themselves. You don't need to combine them. And E is you do not have the necessary information to answer the question. It's not sufficient. So if we go back to this question here, J divided by K is an integer. Well, what numbers could J be if J times K is 12? Well, J could, for example, J could be 12 and J could be 6. Or J could be negative 12 and negative 6. You must consider all possible types of numbers, positive numbers and negative numbers. So number 1 by itself is not sufficient because it has 4 possible answers. For something to be sufficient, there must be only 1 possible answer. So number 1 is not sufficient. Statement 2. K divided by 2 is an integer. Well, if j times k is equal to 12, then there are many possible values for k here. It could be 12, it could be 6, it could be 4, it could be 2, or negative 12, negative 6, negative 4, and negative 2. So statement number 2 has 8 possible values for k. So it's not sufficient. If we combine the 2 statements, we know that k is a multiple of 2 and j is a multiple of 6. So what values could make this statement true? Well, you can do 6 times 2 is equal to 12. But you could also do negative 6 times negative 2 is equal to 12. So even if you combine the 2 pieces of information, we still don't know the values of j and k. So we can't answer this question. So the answer would be echo. It's not sufficient to answer. Okay. Now, the GRE has their own version of a unique question type, but it's logically a lot simpler. It is effectively a unspecified inequality. So the rules of inequalities would apply here. The general rules of inequalities is if you divide or multiply by a negative number, you flip the direction of the inequality, and you cannot divide or multiply by variables in inequalities unless you know the charges of the variables. So you can apply these rules to answer these questions, and they effectively function as an inequality, just you don't know the direction of it. There are 2 different types. There are number properties, and then there are problem solving. These tend to test concepts more than algebra, but they do, in the medium and lower difficulty questions, they will mostly focus on the algebra. These are very easy to master. From my experience, maybe an hour to 2 hour practice, and you will get these questions down fairly easily. Again, just like on the GMAT, on a lot of the harder ones, especially the higher difficulty, you shouldn't be doing the calculation because you don't need to know what the values are. You just need to know which one is larger. So you tend to want to compare the values rather than calculate the values. Okay, so there are 3 parts in it. You are given facts in the question stem. So in this example, in this sample question, we are given the fact that f of x is equal to 2x. And we are given the fact that g of x is equal to 1/2 of x. And then you are given the 2 quantities, quantity A and quantity B. And again, your job will be to determine which of the 2 is larger. In this particular question, you would probably just do the calculation. So you would plug the values into the functions that you were given and do the calculation. You will have 4 possible answers. A is larger, B is larger, they are equal, or it cannot be determined. So on this example, if you plug a 3 into G, so G of 3 would give you 3/2, and F of 3/2 would give you 3. That means quantity A would be 3. If you do the same thing for quantity B, F of 3 would be 6. And then G of 6 would be 3. So quantity B is also 3. Since quantity A and B are both 3, the answer would be Charlie. They are equal. Okay. The general concepts that both tests test are actually identical. So for example, standard deviation is tested on the GMAT and is tested on the GRE. Combinations and permutations are tested on the GMAT and the GRE, and so on. So a lot of times, if you're not sure which one you should study, which one you want to prepare for, you can actually prepare for either one. But if you're not sure, because I know, for example, some finance programs will accept the GMAT or the GRE, and which one you should take, actually, it's kind of a complicated answer. But if you're not sure which test you want to prepare for just yet, I recommend preparing for the GMAT because the GMAT logic is more challenging than the logic on the GRE. So if you master the logic of the GMAT, the GRE will feel really easy. Okay. But here's some of the examples of the topics that they test: geometry, rates and ratios, algebra, statistics, number properties, sets and series, and a variety of other subjects. Okay. Another area that they are significantly different is in the actual mechanics of the tests themselves. It's actually complicated to explain the exact mechanics on the GMAT. I would usually do that on the first day of a course, and it usually takes about 15 to 20 minutes. So I'm not going to do that right now. But the basic concept of the GMAT is that it uses a floating average to determine the value, to determine your performance. And the value of your floating average will determine the value of the next question. So harder questions will have higher value, lower questions will have lower value. The more difficult questions can be worth as much as 4 times as much as the lower value questions. What that means is the value of the questions matters more than the percentage correct on the GMAT. And the way it works on the GMAT is you answer a question, and generally speaking, if you get the question correct, the next question will be harder. And if you get the question wrong, the next question will be easier. Again, this is not exactly how it works, but it's an easy way to explain it. And so on the GMAT, what matters most is consistency. You want to be consistent throughout your test. Getting questions correct matters more than the number of questions you get correct. And if you do poorly in any section of the GMAT, you will get a bad score. If you do bad at the beginning, you're going to get a bad score. If you do bad in the middle, you're going to get a bad score. It's really hard to bring your score back up if you have a string of incorrect answers. So if you get 6 or 7 questions in a row incorrect, it doesn't matter how you do on the rest of the test. You're basically done. Okay? Okay. And the last change in the GMAT, when they shortened the test a bit, all they did is removed the experimental questions. They did experimental questions for about 20 years to get a baseline for the values of the different questions. And they have finished doing the experiments, so they no longer do experimental questions. When I got my best score on the GMAT was a 780. When I got a 780, which is 99th percentile, when I got that, I only had 79% correct. And that's something you need to understand on the GMAT. It's a huge difference between GMAT and GRE. You do not get every question correct on the GMAT. No one gets 100% correct on the GMAT. I've had one student who got an 800, and when she got an 800, she was around 92%, if I remember correctly, correct. So even with a perfect score, she still missed quite a few questions. So trying to get every question correct on the GMAT is not a realistic target, and you don't need to. You want to get around about 75 to 85% correct. Okay. Now the GRE is also an adaptive test, just like the GMAT, in that how you perform will change the difficulty of the questions. However, rather than doing it immediately, they do it by section. How you perform in the first section will determine the value and difficulty of the questions in the second section. What that means is if you want to do well on the GRE, it is extremely important that you do well in that first section. If you don't do well in the first section, the second section questions will be significantly lower value. And after that, it will basically be impossible for you to get a good score. If you miss more than 5 questions on the first section on the GRE, you will not get a good score. Okay? Okay. Now there is going to be an experimental section on the GRE. It can be either quant or verbal. Technically, it can be essays, an experimental essay, but those are very rare. Most likely, you're going to have an experimental quant section or an experimental verbal section. So it's either going to go quant, verbal, quant, or verbal, quant, verbal. The experimental section does not count for you or towards your score or against your score. You could technically skip it and would have no impact. The problem is you have no idea which section is experimental, so you kind of have to do it anyways. Okay. There is a lot less tolerance for mistakes on the GRE. Again, I only took the GRE once, and I did score the 99th percentile. But how to put it? If you want to score the 99th percentile on the GRE, you need to get 100% correct. Getting like 3 questions wrong on the GRE, and you'll probably already be down to 95th percentile. So getting questions wrong on the GRE will lower your ranking a lot quicker than it would on the GMAT. And again, this deals with the focus of the test. The GMAT is testing logic, so the questions are a lot harder, so they have a higher threshold for mistakes. They expect you to make more mistakes because the questions are just logically much more challenging. But on the GRE, they're testing your knowledge. And so they don't expect you to make as many mistakes. If you're good at math, the GRE math is actually very simple. So they expect you to get at least 95% correct or above. And the highest difficulty questions on the GRE would probably not even be considered high value questions on the GMAT. More like medium high on GMAT would be equivalent to difficulty to the highest value questions on the GRE. So again, the questions are easier, but you can't make mistakes, at least not very many of them. Okay. GMAT is primarily for MBA programs. Kind of already went over this. The GRE is accepted for the majority of programs. It's a much broader test. From my experience also, GMAT or MBA programs are very, very competitive. So it is harder to get accepted to a program requiring GMAT than it is a program requiring GRE. Probably about maybe 20 to 30% of my GRE students end up being accepted to top tier schools. In fact, I had one year where I had 11 students accepted to Harvard, and 9 of them were GRE students. Okay, so my experience is it's easier to get into a high-end program at a top-tier school using GRE than it is using GMAT. Now, another mistake that a lot of people make though with GMAT is everyone thinks they have to have like 750 or 800 to be accepted to a top school. That is not true. I've had a student accepted to Harvard Business School with a 630, although that is very rare. Most of my students accepted to like Wharton, Harvard, NYU, stuff like that. They're usually around 670, 690, maybe 700, 710. I've only had one student ever get accepted, ever get an 800. Okay, so you don't need an 800 to go to a top tier school. You need to get into the upper 600s to lower 700s if you want to go to Wharton or Harvard or something like that. Okay. Some business schools, actually I think most now, will accept GRE, but my experience is students applying to business schools with a GRE have a much lower acceptance rate. I think one of the reasons why is while the math portion of the GRE is much easier, the vocabulary on the verbal portion is extremely difficult. Even for native speakers like myself, the vocabulary is very esoteric. And as a non-native speaker, it's extremely challenging for you guys to get a good enough score to get into an MBA program using a GRE score. So if you're going for an MBA program, I strongly recommend GMAT instead of GRE, even if the school will accept the GRE. Okay, preparing for the GMAT or the GRE. Again, as mentioned before, if you want to prepare for one, if you're not sure which one you want to prepare for, you can just pick one and start preparing for it. Most of the subjects overlap. The main difference between the verbal is that the GMAT has sentence correction, GRE has vocabulary, but they both have critical reasoning and reading comprehension that are the same basic concepts. And the math almost completely overlaps in terms of subjects, but one has data sufficiency, the other has quantitative comparison. But again, if you study the math on the GMAT, that will help you for the math on the GRE. So if you're not sure which one, just pick one and start preparing for it. Again, you want to understand the differences between the tests. We went over some of them here, but not all of it. Okay, the next two are ones that are probably the most common mistakes I see people make. If you're going to planning on taking the test in a month, it's kind of too late for it late. You really need to give yourself a proper leeway to study. 6 to 9 months is generally what I recommend. Now, depends, of course, that will depend on what your initial score is. If you take a practice test and you got a 630 and you want to get a 670 or above, yeah, you can do that in a month. But if you take the practice test and you have 450 and you want a 670, you are not going to get that in a month. You can do it. From my experience, everyone can get a 700 on the GMAT, and everyone can get a 165 or above on the GRE quant. But you need to be realistic on the time and effort it's going to require. Okay. Create a study plan. Okay, so from my experience for GMAT, students who take my course with me, the score goes up and on average around 80 to 100 points. So if you're at a 500, you can expect to be about 600 or so by the end of the course. Now, if you want a 670, that means you're going to need to gain that other 70 points through self-study or additional effort. And the additional effort on the GMAT, from my experience, works out to about 1.2 hours per point you want to gain. So if you're at a 500 and you're taking the course, you need to plan on self-study of about 84 hours of self-study. And so you should make a realistic study plan where you are going to be putting in that amount of time to get your target score. On the GRE, from my experiences, it takes about 8 to 12 hours per point that you want to gain on the GRE. And the average increase on quant is about 6 points, and average increase on verbal is about 4 to 5 points. So once again, make a plan and plan accordingly. And be realistic on that. Don't plan on studying 8 hours a day. For one, you're not going to. And also, research has shown that studying more than 4 hours a day actually hurts you more than it helps you. Studying 4 hours for a standardized test is better than studying 6 hours. Okay. The ideal range is usually about 2 to 4 hours, and you should study about 3 to 4 times a week. Studying every day is not a realistic plan. Almost nobody does that. So again, make a realistic study plan. And as it says there, from my experience, literally everyone can get a good score, but you have to have realistic expectations on the effort it's going to require you to get that good score. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so I got a couple questions. Okay, I don't know what that link is. Okay, does that mean to pursue the graduate of social science is better to take the GRE? Yeah, pretty much if you want to go to law school, you take the LSAT. If you want to go to medical school, it's MCAT. For MBA would be business school, you would take the GMAT. Otherwise, you take the GRE. The GRE is the general catch-all. Depending on the program you're going for, they maybe have a subject test required as well. So for example, they have a GRE subject test for mathematics if you want to get your master's or PhD in mathematics. And that will be much, much harder than the math on the general reasoning test. Okay. Okay, a couple of you have questions. Can you unmute?
Which one will be the first one?
Okay.
I think you first.
Okay.
All right. Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah. My first question is, well, actually, I want to continue my PhD program in business. So it means that I have to take GMAT, right? Yeah. What about the GMAT score is required for PhD program? And then if I cannot pass the minimum score, should I retake the test? Or do we have? Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
There's quite a few questions there. I actually don't know. I don't think I've had a student go for a PhD program in business school. Usually people get their MBA and they're done. So if you already have your MBA, I'm not sure what's the normal test requirement. As for taking it multiple times, that was also one of the changes they made maybe about 3 or 4 years ago. You can basically there's a limited number of times you can take the test per year and stuff, and also a lifetime limit. But the schools usually will look at your best score. So if you go back like 10 years ago, I know Harvard 10 years ago would average your last 3 scores, and that caused some problems for my students if you had a bad score, because then they would have to take it 3 more times. And at that time, you could only take it 3 times per year, so they effectively had to wait a year, and it was a mess. But I believe now it's a lot simpler. You just take the test, I believe, 5 or 6 times a year. They change the rules once in a while, so you should probably, I'll have to look that up for you. But you can take it a few times, and then just whichever one's your best score is usually the one that the school will take. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Oke, Zevanya.
Okay, thank you so much for the chance. I want to ask some questions about your presentation. The presentation is very good, by the way. Thank you so much. I didn't know anything about GRE and GMAT before this webinar, so I asked some basic questions. The first one is, if we compare the price between GMAT and GRE, which one is the cheapest one?
I wouldn't know that. Last I knew, the GRE was cheaper than the GMAT. The last test I took was GMAT, and I think that was 2014. So it's been a while. Yeah.
Oh,
but my guess would be
then.
GMAT is probably more expensive than GRE, but I'm not positive of that.
Okay. So my next question, because you said that GMAT is a lot harder than GRE, does that mean that if, for example, if I can get a good score at GMAT, does that mean that I can automatically get a good score at GRE too?
From my experience on the math, at least, I'm just speaking on the math. The verbal is a different answer, okay? But on the math, definitely. So my experience was this. So when I was looking at teaching for GMAT and GRE in the States, all the good schools required you to be in the 99th percentile. And so that's why I took the test, was trying to get 99th percentile. On the GRE, my first try, without any preparation, I got a perfect score on the math. On my first try on the GMAT, I got around 70, I think 74% correct, if I remember correctly. So I missed about a quarter of the questions on the GMAT my first try, but I got everything correct on the GRE my first try. So if you can get good at the math on the GMAT, the math on the GRE will seem ridiculously easy. Okay, because the higher difficulty questions on the GMAT. Okay, I'll give you an example of one. This is a question I remember from my I think it was my second test. In terms of n, what is the probability that a triangle drawn among the vertices of an n-sided polygon will share at least one side of the polygon? Okay, that's a GMAT type question. Like, I was able to solve it out. I solved it on the test by picking numbers, right? But the way I solved it, when I tried to solve it algebraically, it took me 40 minutes to solve it. So if you want to solve that question properly, that's a 40-minute question, right? That type of question would never appear on the GRE. The GRE does not have questions like that. But the GMAT has questions that are like that, and questions where I remember, like, I read them and I couldn't even understand what they really wanted me to do because it was just weird, right? So that's one of the main differences between the GMAT and the GRE. The GMAT, you're not expected to get everything correct, but the questions can get ridiculously hard. Like, and now the shortcuts for it and stuff like that I teach in the course to help with the GMAT, the hard questions in the GMAT. But yeah, so if you master the questions in the GMAT, then the GRE math will seem really easy.
All right then. I have another question for you, sir.
Okay.
I have known that, you know, for some English certificate like TOEFL or IELTS, you will have some duration, which means that the certification can only be used for that duration. For example, like TOEFL, you can only use that certification for only 2 years. And for GMAT and GRE certification, is there any things like that, the time duration?
There is a time duration, and last I checked, but again, I haven't checked it in a few years, but last I checked was 5 years.
Oh,
but you should probably check to see. I know they changed a lot of the rules with the pandemic, because now you can actually take the test at home. You don't even have to go to the test center to take the GRE and GMAT. And when they did that, they changed some of the rules, and I'm not quite sure where the rules are at exactly right now. But last I checked, it was about 5 years.
Okay. Sorry guys for interrupt. Milo, do you have class at 4 or not?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Our time it's only in 3 minutes, yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Do you still have any questions, Jevanya?
I think no, that's all.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. It's enough, yeah, Jevanya. Thank you, yeah. So sorry. I'm so sorry about the Pancha and also Hanin that we cannot answer your question. So if you still want to answer, if you want to get the answer from the Mr. Milo, you can direct chat to Kaplan Edupac Ernie, and Milo will send the answer to Ernie and let you get the answer from Ernie. Okay, I think it's enough, Milo and everybody. Thank you sorry for the limit time that we have.
Yeah, I have a course.
I hope we meet again in the see you in the next day. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Bye.
Yeah.